Okay, part 3 of our study of the executive branch is going to focus on how the president communicates and then some of the limits on presidential power. So throughout history, presidents have had all kinds of new ways to communicate with the American people. Think about somebody like George Washington. Nobody ever heard his voice outside of his administration or Congress because there was no way to communicate, through audio to the American people. So everything he said was written secondhand in newspapers. Things about his administration were printed secondhand in newspapers. It really wasn't until the late 1800s that they made recordings of the president's voices. Photography, same thing. I mean, photography, the first presidents in the 1830s and 40s were the first ones to be photographed, so you could actually see what the president looked like. So our modern communication devices compared to that are amazing. So the first president, you probably know this, the first president to really effectively communicate with the American people was Franklin Roosevelt. He had, a few times a year, he'd had fireside chats. He went on the radio, spoke directly to the American people. He bypassed the press, basically, which is a smart thing to do because sometimes you don't like what the press says about you if you're president. So I'm just going to go, he said, I'm going to go directly to the American people. So he spoke to them about the issues of the time. And he was the first one to say things like, my fellow Americans or citizens. He talked to them like they were like they were in the room with him. John F. Kennedy was the first one to use television addresses to effectively reach the public. He's not the first one to use the television, but he was the first one to use it effectively. Speeches directly to the American people became important. As far as press conferences go, Teddy Roosevelt was the first one to do a press conference. And then, of course, the internet is the presidency uses the internet to effectively communicate with the United States, with the people. The president has always given a weekly radio address. It's always at 12 o'clock on Saturdays. President Obama moved it to YouTube. President Trump added it to Facebook Live. So you can watch the weekly presidential address. And when the president will say, here's what happened this week, and here's why I did the things that I did, and here's what's coming up next week. Okay? And then, of course, social media, and I would include the White House website on that as well. The social media, the internet aspect of social media, how many people you can reach. I mean, President Trump has been called the tweeter-in-chief. His tweets reach, not only the American people, but around the world. You can see in his I don't remember when I took these screenshots, but this is he has two Twitter feeds. He has a White House feed where there's 26.2 million followers. So that's the official White House, what goes on that day. Here's what the president is doing. Oh, look, the president met with the Treasury Secretary, and he's working on a COVID relief bill, that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's kind of the official White House, what's going on. Somebody is hired to do this Twitter feed, okay? Now, he also has his own personal one where he has 61.8 million followers. So he's got almost 3 times more followers on his personal feed than he does on the official White House feed. Now, this official White House feed, when Joe Biden becomes president, that'll all switch to Joe Biden, and his staff will start doing the official Twitter feeds. But Trump will still have his personal feed here. He still have his 61.8 million followers, and he could use that as a way, even though he's not president again, or not, he didn't get a second term, but he could probably use that to inform people about what's going on politically, according to his views. So the difference is, the presidential one is, the official White House one, and then his personal one, he can say whatever he wants on that, which he does. To reach, like I said, almost 3 times as many people as the White House, official White House feed. So the question becomes, what would you use? You get to keep this after you're done being president. That's pretty powerful. You can still influence your followers there. Okay, so communication has become an extremely important part of the presidency, especially as communication devices have become more elaborate and can reach more people. Okay, now let's look at checks on the presidential power, okay? The president, the checks on the president are the 22nd Amendment. One of them is the 22nd Amendment. The president is limited to 2 terms. He's the only person in the federal government that has a term limit. Senators and representatives can be elected for as many terms as they want. They don't have any limits. As you know, or you may not know, that federal judges, including Supreme Court judges, serve for life. So he's the only one that has a a term limit. The 25th Amendment is a check on the president's power. It deals with presidential succession. What happens if the president can't be president, has to have surgery, has a stroke, has to resign because of legal issues? Okay, what happens then? Well, you all know the vice president becomes president, but what happens if something happens to both of them? And we faced that as a nation in the early to mid-'70s when President Nixon was under investigation for Watergate. He didn't know if he was going to survive his second term. He might be impeached and removed. Well, meanwhile, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, was caught in a bribery scheme that he started and participated in way before he became vice president. He resigned. So what would happen if we didn't have a vice president, because Spiro Agnew resigned, and then Nixon, who resigned the presidency, he's the only person to do that? What would happen if neither one of them can be president? Well, it would then go to the Secretary of State. So they spell that out in the 25th Amendment. It also deals with presidential disability. What happens if the president has surgery? President Bush had knee surgery when he was president. Obviously, when he's under the influence of anesthesia, he can't make decisions. So he writes a letter, giving it to the Secretary of State, saying, for the next 3 hours, I'm not going to be president. The vice president, Richard Cheney, will be acting president. And then when he comes to and everything's okay, the president sends another letter saying, I'm back, everything's fine, I'm president again. But what were to happen if the president has, this happened to Woodrow Wilson, he had a debilitating stroke. He couldn't speak or write for months because he was recovering from a stroke. That was before the 25th Amendment was put into place. Had that happened now, if that were to happen now, the majority of the cabinet can do that and take power away from the president and say, we're giving the power to the vice president. Again, has to sign a letter to the Secretary of State saying, we, the cabinet, think that the president can no longer execute his or her office. So we're going to go ahead and give that power to the vice president. And they can, of course, take it from the vice president and give it back to the president as well. Which brings up, what happens if a president has, because I know in Ronald Reagan's second term in office, people were wondering, does he have Alzheimer's? He was the oldest president at the time, and he was starting to show signs of Alzheimer's. And that eventually, he died of that in 2004. But what happens if the president is, has some kind of, like Alzheimer's, and the cabinet's like, we don't think he can make good decisions anymore. He has an illness of the brain. They can invoke the 25th Amendment there and give power to the vice president. The Senate has a check on the president. Anytime the president appoints somebody to a major office, including the Supreme Court of the United States, the Senate has to give its okay on that. And then Congress has lawmaking powers. They can, if the president says, I would like Congress to take this law up. Happened to President Bush in his second term. He wanted to reform Social Security. And people in his own party said, we're not going to do that because we don't want to tick off seniors. They vote a lot. We don't want to change the Social Security system. So they can flat out ignore the president, which they did. They did not take up his initiative there. The legislative branch can also override a presidential veto. That's another check. And the ultimate check is impeachment and removal. The House can vote to impeach the president, which has happened 3 times in our history now. Andrew Johnson was impeached back in the 1860s. Bill Clinton was impeached back in the late 1990s. And then last year, right before COVID hit, President Trump was impeached. If they're impeached, all that means is they're being brought up on charges. Okay? They still are in office if they're impeached. It's like if a grand jury indicts somebody of a crime. That's what impeachment is. It's like a grand jury. Okay? It takes a simple majority of the House of Representatives to impeach the president. Okay? Next, the second step to that is the removal trial in the Senate. We've had 3 removal trials in the Senate. All 3 presidents survived their removal trial. Clinton and Trump survived by a wide margin. It takes 2/3 of the Senate to vote to to remove a president. Andrew Johnson won his trial, but he won by 1 vote. So if one senator had voted the other way, he would have been removed from office. And that's a big deal. That's undoing an election. That's never happened. So we've had 3 impeached, brought up on charges by the House of Representatives, and then all 3 won their removal trials. So they remained president after that. Okay? Now, a few other things to consider. Executive agreements, we talked about that. Is the president making laws without congressional approval? That's something to think about with executive agreements. And of course, ultimately, the Supreme Court makes that decision. President has pardoning power. The president can let people that have already been convicted of crimes out of jail. If they're pardoned by the president, they're removed from jail. If their sentences can be commuted. So if they're in jail and let's say they get life in prison, the president can commute their sentence to 20 years if they want to. That's controversial because, and the presidents, not a lot of presidents use the pardoning power, or if they use it, it's towards the end of their term, because it's so controversial. But it's an unchecked power. The president, as long as somebody is in federal court or have been convicted of a federal crime, they can be pardoned. Their sentences can be commuted. The president can take somebody on death row and say, I'm commuting their sentence from death to life in prison. The most controversial pardon was after Nixon resigned from office. There was still a question of whether or not Richard Nixon could be placed in court because he did commit crimes as president of the United States. The president at the time, Gerald Ford, pardoned him of all crimes he did commit at that point. So that kind of put that issue to rest where, okay, now we can't put the president on trial because he's already pardoned. He's pre-pardoned basically for a trial. Executive privilege, withholding information from the public. Can the president do that? The answer generally is yes, if it involves national security secrets. For instance, there might be a memo that the president gives saying, all right, I am promoting these 5 CIA agents to the highest level, and they are now, they have top secret protection. We don't want the rest of the world to know that they're CIA agents so they can effectively work undercover. We don't want that information getting out. So the president can say executive privilege. Everything the president signs, everything the president puts in a document, every email the president sends becomes part of the public record, okay? And the president has the ability to say this is not going to be part of the public record because of it. There's privileged information in there. There's top secret information. The president can't do that to protect himself or herself, but generally the president can do that to protect others. Okay, for a while the president had a line item veto. When the president vetoes a law, they always veto the entire law. Most governors of states have the power to do a line item veto. Instead of vetoing an entire law, they veto parts of a law. So they say like, hey, I like everything on the law up to page 5. Page 5 through 8, I'm vetoing that. I don't like that. And of course, the legislature can override that. That was declared unconstitutional. President Clinton was the only president to have that power. That was declared unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court because it altered the Constitution. The wording of the Constitution says the president vetoes the entire law. Well, you can't add a law that changes the Constitution. The only thing that's allowed to change the Constitution, the wording of the Constitution, is an amendment. So the Supreme Court said the law that gives the president the line item veto is unconstitutional. If you want to make the line item veto constitutional, you got to add an amendment to the Constitution. Okay? Every time the president gets a bill and signs it into law, the president issues a signing statement when he or she signs that law. And the signing statement, you can look these up, they're part of the public record, the president says, this is what I think the law means. Here's how I'm going to enforce the law. Now, does this have any legal force or power? The answer is yes and no. yes for that president. Okay, so if President Obama signs a law and then issued a signing statement, more and more presidents are doing this. So this is how I interpret the law. The next president doesn't have to follow that. Trump could have said, yeah, these signing statements signed by Obama, I'm tossing them all. I'm issuing my own signing statements. So yes, they have a legal force, and a little bit of legal force, but they do have power, but only until that president is in office. Okay, the president has a staff. There's a staff that works at the White House with the president. We'll find this out when we study the bureaucracy. The staff that works at the White House, his chief of staff, his joint chiefs of staff that's in charge of the military, his economic advisor, his office of management and budget person, they're at the White House every day. They have a lot of influence over the president because what they can do is just go down the hallway, knock on the Oval Office door and say, hey, Mr. President, I want to run something by you. Okay, so when you work in close proximity to somebody, you have more influence over them because you can see them on a day-by-day or an hour-by-hour basis. If you're the Secretary of Defense, you're working at the Pentagon. The Pentagon isn't even in Washington, D.C. It's across the Potomac River in Virginia, in Arlington, Virginia. So you can't just do a pop-in for the president. You got to make an appointment. And so you have less influence because you're not there at the White House if you're one of the secretaries or you work in one of the bureaucratic offices. Okay? So whoever's at the White House has more influence on the president than people that work outside of the White House that are in the executive branch. Okay, public approval. Does the president pay attention to this? If you ask a president, they'll say, no, I never paid attention to public approval. And I can tell you right now, they're flat out lying. They always pay attention to public approval because no president is going to continually push through laws that the American people don't like because they're not going to be reelected. Okay, so the president does pay attention to public approval. And then last on our list is a relationship with Congress. Why is a positive relationship important? I think you know the answer to that question. Because if the president is not liked by Congress, he's not going to get his agenda passed. A good example is Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was president from 77 and 81. He was a one-termer. He ran for re-election and lost in that re-election in a landslide. Okay? He was a Democrat. There were Democratic majorities in the Senate and the House of Representatives. He could not get his agenda passed, even though he was with the same party. The reason he couldn't get his agenda passed is because he did not have a good relationship with the leaders of Congress. They didn't like each other. And so they didn't pass his agenda because they didn't like President Carter, but they didn't like his agenda. Okay? Whereas somebody like Ronald Reagan, who was a very likable president. I mentioned this I don't know if it was in either part 1 or part 3, but Ronald Reagan was more successful at getting his agenda passed, even though those same Democratic majorities were in the House and the Senate. Ronald Reagan was a Republican. He had a great relationship with Congress, and he worked very well with Congress, even though it was the opposite party of him. So a positive relationship is extremely, extremely important. Okay, that's the end of the content for the executive branch. If you have any questions, as always, send me an email or come into office hours.